What if the justice system wasn't broken, but rigged from the start? A brilliant lawyer, a corrupt town, a deadly conspiracy. When Elijah Carter takes a wrong turn into a small southern town, he thinks it's just another stop on the road, until flashing lights appear in his rearview mirror. A routine traffic stop turns into a nightmare, a setup designed to erase him. But they made one mistake. They picked the wrong man to silence. Because Elijah isn't just fighting for his freedom. He's about to expose the system built to destroy men like him. The deeper he digs, the deadlier it gets. The committee is watching. The law is a weapon. And the truth? It's more dangerous than anyone ever imagined. How far would you go if the system was built to bury you? The highway stretched endlessly under the darkening sky, the setting sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. Elijah Carter adjusted his grip on the steering wheel of his sleek black Mercedes. The hum of the engine steadied beneath his fingers. The conference in Houston had gone well. Another panel on criminal justice reform. Another round of debates on racial profiling and police accountability. He had spoken with conviction, as he always did, and the applause had been polite but distant. Change was slow, and Elijah had long since learned that justice wasn't a matter of winning arguments, it was a matter of persistence. The green road sign flashed by overhead. Ashford 12 miles. He had debated taking the longer route through the interstate. But the GPS had suggested this shortcut, shaving 30 minutes off his drive home to New Orleans. He hesitated for a moment but dismissed the nagging feeling in his gut. He wasn't superstitious. He had spent years believing in one simple truth: if you followed the law, you had nothing to fear. Still, the further he drove into Ashford, the quieter it became. The landscape had shifted from open highway to narrow, cracked roads lined with old gas stations and boarded-up shops. Storefronts with faded, closed signs. Rusted-out cars parked in driveways of houses with peeling paint. A town that had seen better days, or maybe had never seen good days at all. Elijah slowed as he approached a gas station on the corner, its neon sign flickering uncertainly. His fuel gauge was lower than he liked. He pulled into the lot, parking beside one of the two working pumps. The moment he stepped out, he felt it. Eyes. A pair of elderly men sat on a bench outside the convenience store, their conversation halting mid-sentence the second they saw him. A woman pumping gas across from him avoided eye contact, rushing to finish and get back into her car. Elijah sighed and shook his head. It wasn't the first time he'd been the only black man in a small southern town. He was used to the stares, the unspoken questions. Inside, the gas station was dimly lit, its shelves stocked with the bare essentials: cans of soup, dusty boxes of cereal, and a row of faded candy bars near the counter. The clerk, a wiry man with a scruffy beard, barely looked up from his magazine when Elijah approached. "Pump 3, Elijah said, placing his credit card on the counter. The man took it, eyes flicking to him for just a second before swiping the card. "You from around here?" Elijah exhaled quietly. He had heard this before, always the same tone, just shy of outright hostility. "Just passing through." The man nodded slowly, handing the card back. "Pump's ready." Elijah turned to leave but stopped when the man spoke again, his voice lower this time, almost hesitant. "If I were you, I wouldn't stick around too long." Elijah paused, glancing back at him. "Is that so?" The man's jaw tightened, and he nodded toward the window. "You see that car out there?" Elijah followed his gaze. Parked just across the street was a police cruiser, its headlights off, but inside, two officers sat watching. "They've been sitting there a while," the clerk muttered, "and they ain't too fond of outsiders." Elijah forced a polite smile. "I appreciate the warning." Outside, he felt the tension in the air like a static charge. He inserted the nozzle into his gas tank, his movements measured, controlled. He could feel the police officer's eyes on him, watching, waiting. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. A message from his brother, Malcolm Carter. "How was the conference?" Elijah smirked, typing back, "Same old speeches. Heading home now. Should be back in a couple of hours." No need to mention Ashford. No need to make a big deal out of nothing. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. He replaced the nozzle and slid back into his car. As he pulled out of the gas station, the police cruiser did the same. They weren't just watching anymore. They were following. The red and blue lights flared up in his rearview mirror, cutting through the dim evening haze like a warning. Elijah's grip on the wheel tightened. He took a slow, measured breath and eased his car onto the shoulder, just as he had done a dozen times before in his life. This wasn't new. The engine hummed quietly as he shifted into park. His heartbeat, steady moments ago, had picked up an uneasy rhythm. He checked his side mirror. 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a thick mustache and a stiff gait. And a younger officer, leaner, eyes sharp and calculating. Their hands rested near their belts. Not aggressive, not yet, but expectant. Elijah unrolled his window as the older officer approached. His name tag read Delaney. "Evening, sir," Delaney drawled, his voice slow and deliberate. "You know why we pulled you over?" Elijah kept his tone calm. "Professional." "No, officer, I don't." Delaney nodded as if considering his response. "Your taillight's out." Elijah exhaled through his nose. A lie. He had checked his car before leaving Houston. The vehicle had been serviced just last week. "Respectfully, officer, I believe my taillights are in perfect condition. May I step out and take a look?" The younger officer, Langley, according to his badge, scoffed. "Step out of the car. Counselor, let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Elijah hesitated, then slowly reached for the door handle. Every movement was deliberate, no sudden motions, no reason for them to claim he was a threat. He stepped onto the gravel, the cool air brushing against the back of his neck. Langley circled to the rear of the car while Delaney stood firm near the driver's side. Elijah followed, keeping his hands in sight. The taillight, just as he knew it would be, was intact. He turned to say something when he heard it, the soft click of a latch. Delaney had popped the trunk. A slow dread crept up Elijah's spine. "You don't have probable cause to search my vehicle, officer." Delaney ignored him. He leaned forward, peering inside. Then, silence. A few long, unbearable seconds before Langley let out a whistle. Well, Langley murmured, turning toward them with something pinched between his gloved fingers. A plastic bag filled with white powder. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, voice even, but laced with a rising heat. Delaney didn't smirk. He didn't grin. He just nodded, as if the outcome had been inevitable. That's possession with intent to distribute. Elijah's mind reeled. This wasn't a routine stop. This wasn't about a taillight. This was a setup. He took a step forward, voice low but controlled. "That is not mine. You planted that." Langley sighed, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "They always say that." Elijah's pulse pounded against his skull. His training screamed at him to stay calm, to be methodical. He was a lawyer. He knew the law better than these men ever would. But that didn't matter here. Delaney reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around." Elijah stood his ground. "I am a practicing attorney. You have no legal basis for." Delaney grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back with practiced ease. Elijah gritted his teeth, stumbling slightly as the cold steel of the handcuffs clamped onto his wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," Delaney said, his breath warm and stale against Elijah's ear. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Elijah's mind raced. He had handled wrongful arrest cases. He had seen men in his position before, their protests drowned out by procedure. But this wasn't just about him. This was something bigger. The radio on Delaney's hip crackled to life. A garbled voice came through, casual but firm. "One big fish. Take him to the usual spot. We'll handle the rest." A cold weight settled in Elijah's stomach. The usual spot? The rest of what? Langley and Delaney exchanged a glance. A silent understanding passed between them. Elijah looked out at the darkened road ahead, the isolation pressing in on him. This wasn't just a bad traffic stop. It was a machine, one that had been running long before he got here. And now, he was caught in it. As they shoved him into the back of the police cruiser, his only thought was this: what the hell had he just walked into? The fluorescent light above flickered erratically, casting sharp, uneven shadows against the cold, gray walls. Elijah sat stiffly in the metal chair, his wrists aching from the too tight handcuffs. The interrogation room smelled of old coffee and disinfectant. A sterile yet suffocating mix. Across from him, Sheriff Frank Delaney leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lazily against the table. "You know," Delaney began, his voice almost conversational, "I gotta say, it's not every day we catch a big fish like you." He gave Elijah a slow, knowing smirk. "A lawyer, huh? And not just any lawyer. You're Malcolm Carter's little brother." Elijah didn't react. He wouldn't give this man the satisfaction. Delaney tilted his head. "What's the matter? Not gonna correct me? You seem like the type who enjoys making speeches about justice and all that nonsense." Elijah met his gaze steadily. "If you have a case against me, charge me. If not, let me go." Delaney chuckled, shaking his head. "Now, see, that's not how this works. A smart man like you should know that." He leaned forward, the pretense of friendliness fading. "I'll give you some advice. Counselor, take the deal. Plead guilty. We make this easy. You're out in a few years. Maybe even less with good behavior." Elijah's jaw tightened. "And if I don't?" Delaney's smirk widened. "Then we do things the hard way." He slapped a thick file onto the table. "We've got the drugs. We've got your fingerprints on the car. We even have witness statements from people who claim they saw you acting suspiciously at the gas station." He flipped open the folder, pushing a document forward. "And let's not forget your record. Looks like this ain't your first run-in with drug charges." Elijah frowned. He had no record. His slate was clean. He had spent years ensuring that every legal action he took was by the book. But there, printed in black and white, was a fabricated rap sheet: arrests, prior convictions, even a stint in county jail that had never happened. His pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't incompetence. This was a system, a machine that had done this before. "You people are unbelievable," Elijah muttered, forcing himself to stay calm. "You actually think you can make this stick?" Delaney shrugged. "I don't need to think. I know." He gestured vaguely around them. "You're in Ashford, son. Do you really think anyone out there is gonna stand up for you? This town runs on rules you don't get to make." Elijah exhaled slowly. His mind worked through his options. But there were none. He was alone here, outnumbered, trapped. The sheriff leaned in, voice lowering to a near whisper. "You're gonna sit in that cell. And no one's coming for you. Not your fancy brother, not your lawyer friends, and sure as hell not the truth. So, I'll ask you one last time. Are you gonna fight the entire system? Or are you gonna be smart?" Elijah held his gaze. "I think you already know my answer." Delaney's smirk finally faded. With a grunt, he pushed back from the table and motioned to the door. "Put him in a cell. Let him stew." Elijah didn't resist as two officers hauled him up. But as they led him down the dim hallway, his mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't just about him. They had planned this. And they had done it before. The holding cell was small. Barely enough room for the rusted bench bolted to the wall. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and damp concrete. As Elijah adjusted to his surroundings, he realized he wasn't alone. In the opposite corner, a man sat with his back against the wall, arms crossed. His salt and pepper hair was unkempt, his clothes slightly wrinkled but well kept. There was an air of quiet defiance about him, despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "You must be new," the man said, voice hoarse but steady. Elijah studied him. "And you must not be." The man let out a dry chuckle. "Name's Andre Collins. I used to teach criminal justice over at Tuskegee University." "That was, before." Elijah frowned. "Before what?" Andre's expression darkened. "Before they did to me what they're doing to you now." A chill crept up Elijah's spine. "How long have you been in here?" Andre shrugged. "Lost count. But I can tell you this much, Ashford doesn't let men like us walk away." Elijah's stomach tightened. "You're saying this isn't just random?" Andre scoffed. "Random? No. They pick carefully. They go after the ones who can't fight back first. Poor folks. Transients. People without connections." He paused, eyes narrowing. "And then, every so often, they get bold. They go after someone bigger." Elijah felt the weight of Andre's words settle over him. "You don't get it yet. Do you?" Andre continued. "This isn't just about pinning a crime on you. They want to erase you. Your name, your career, everything. Because you're a problem." Elijah clenched his jaw. "If they wanted to destroy me, they should have done a better job. Because I'm not going down without a fight." Andre studied him for a long moment. Then sighed. Then you better start thinking smart, lawyer, because they don't fight fair. A guard entered the cell block, keys jingling at his hip. He pointed at Elijah. Phone call. Elijah exhaled in relief. Finally, a chance to reach Malcolm. But when he reached the desk, the officer behind it barely glanced at him. No calls allowed. Elijah stiffened. That's my legal right. The officer smirked, sliding his paperwork to the side. Not tonight. It isn't. As Elijah was dragged back toward his cell, his frustration mounted. This wasn't just about a bad arrest. This was a coordinated effort to keep him from the outside world. And then, as he passed by another guard, something unexpected happened. A young officer, barely out of his 20s, slipped something into Elijah's hand so quickly that no one else seemed to notice. A small, folded piece of paper. Elijah waited until he was back in his cell before opening it. 3 words were scrawled across the page. Look up 2015. Marcus Wright. Elijah's mind raced. Who was Marcus Wright, and why did someone inside this corrupt station want him to know that name? Before he could think further, the cell door creaked open again. A different officer stepped in and nodded at Andre. Let's go. Andre didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet. He looked at Elijah, his face unreadable. If I don't come back, he said quietly, find my family. The words hit Elijah like a punch. And then Andre was gone. The door slamming shut behind him. Elijah sat in the dim light, staring at the paper in his hand, a single thought running through his mind. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. Sleep never came. Elijah sat on the edge of the metal bench, his back against the cold concrete wall, his mind looping through the same thought over and over. Marcus Wright. The name clawed at his brain like an unsolved puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Who was he? Why had Peters, one of the very officers in this corrupt place, risk slipping him that name? And, more importantly, why did the very thought of it make his stomach twist with unease? Hours dragged on. The dull hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional shuffle of boots in the hallway, and the distant sound of a ringing phone all blended into a low, oppressive weight pressing down on him. Andre had been gone since last night. No one had said a word. No one even acknowledged his absence. Elijah's gut told him the truth he didn't want to face. Andre wasn't coming back. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. A shadow passed the cell, then doubled back. Officer Peters. The young cop didn't stop walking. Didn't even glance at Elijah directly. But as he passed, his hand flicked against the bars, dropping something. A folded scrap of paper. Elijah snatched it up the second Peters disappeared down the hall. He unfolded it with tense fingers and read the hurried scrawl. Fake a stomachache. When they take you to medical. Third drawer on the right. A sharp pulse of adrenaline shot through Elijah's veins. He had 2 options. Sit and wait to be buried under false charges, or take a risk. Minutes later, Elijah groaned loudly, doubling over as he clutched his stomach. Officer, he called out, his voice strained with effort. It took a few attempts. But finally, a bored-looking deputy ambled over. What now? I think it's food poisoning. Elijah gasped. I ate bad seafood on the way here. My stomach's killing me. He gritted his teeth for effect. I need a doctor, please. The officer sighed, rubbing his forehead. Jesus Christ. Hold on. A few moments later, another officer unlocked the cell and motioned for Elijah to move. Get up. Let's go. He kept up the act, his movements slow, his breathing ragged, as they led him down the hallway. The infirmary wasn't far, just past the main office. Tucked into a quiet wing of the station, the door creaked open, revealing a stark white room with a single cot, a metal cabinet, and a desk stacked with disorganized papers. The officer nudged him toward the cot. Sit tight. Doc'll be in soon. Elijah nodded weakly and watched as the officer strolled back outside, leaving him momentarily alone. This was it. His eyes darted to the cabinet. He stood, careful to make his movements slow. Calculated. He took 2 steps and crouched. His fingers closed around the handle of the third drawer. He pulled. Inside, beneath a mess of outdated medical forms, sat a thick manila folder. 2015 Marcus Wright. Elijah's pulse pounded. He flipped it open. Marcus Wright had been a businessman, a real estate developer, clean record, no prior arrests. Then, in 2015, he had been pulled over just outside of Ashford, Alabama. The charge? Possession with intent to distribute. The same charge Elijah was facing now. 3 days later, Marcus Wright was found dead in his cell. Official cause of death: suicide. Elijah swallowed hard. The pieces were coming together, and the picture they painted was horrifying. Wright's arrest had led to the immediate seizure of all his assets. His properties had been auctioned off, his bank accounts frozen, his business dismantled within weeks. And the buyers? Private prison companies, law enforcement officials, local government figures. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just corruption. This was a business model. The town of Ashford wasn't just falsely arresting black men. They were targeting successful black men. Men with money, assets, power. They planted drugs, fabricated charges, destroyed reputations, and then seized everything. And if those men didn't survive the system? Well, that was just another unfortunate incident. His hands clenched into fists. This was why he had been stopped. This was why they had ignored his legal rights, denied his phone call. They weren't just railroading him for a conviction. They were stripping him of everything. They were erasing him. A noise outside the door snapped him back. Elijah shoved the file into his waistband and straightened just as the door swung open. A graying officer with a beer belly and tired eyes stepped inside. Looking annoyed. What's the problem? Elijah forced himself to grimace, gripping his stomach. Cramps. Feels like my insides are twisting. The officer sighed. Take some water. Go back to your cell. Elijah nodded, letting himself be led back. But as he walked, the weight of the file pressed against his ribs. A hidden secret now strapped to his body. He had proof. But proof meant nothing if he didn't live long enough to use it. Back in his cell, Elijah carefully tucked the file beneath his thin mattress. He needed to get a message out. He needed Malcolm, needed someone outside this nightmare to know what was happening. But as he approached the bars, a slow clap echoed from the hallway. Sheriff Delaney. The older man strolled in, his boots heavy against the concrete floor. He stopped just outside the bars, arms crossed, his smirk filled with something cruel. You really think you're clever, don't you? Delaney murmured. Elijah didn't respond. Delaney chuckled. Oh, don't worry, counselor. I'm gonna enjoy watching you try to fight this. Hell, I'll even let you think you have a shot. He leaned in slightly, voice dropping. But don't get too comfortable. Because tomorrow, you disappear, just like all the others. Elijah's breath slowed. Tomorrow. He had less than 24 hours. Elijah sat motionless on the hard bench, his back pressed against the freezing concrete wall, listening to the distant murmur of voices in the station. His fingers curled into his palms, the pressure grounding him as his mind raced. He had less than 24 hours. Sheriff Delaney's words still lingered in his ears like a venomous whisper. You think you can get out of this? Let me give you a hint. Marcus Wright thought the same thing. The way Delaney said it, calm, almost amused, chilled Elijah more than any threat could. It wasn't a warning, it was a promise. Elijah had spent years navigating the legal system, arguing in courtrooms, tearing apart weak prosecution cases. He knew how to fight within the boundaries of the law. But this wasn't a courtroom. This wasn't about justice. This was survival. The clock was ticking. The evening dragged on, the station settling into the eerie quiet of the night shift. The few officers still on duty moved through the halls lazily, their footsteps echoing in the dimly lit corridor. Elijah barely touched the tray of food shoved through the slot in his cell. He had no appetite. He had no time to eat. Then, the sound of footsteps again, lighter, more hesitant. Daniel Peters, the young officer, approached the cell, his eyes darting nervously down the hallway before he crouched beside the bars. He slid a small, dented food tray under the gap. On the surface, it looked like the same bland meal as before, but tucked beneath the flimsy slice of cornbread was something else. A broken pencil. Elijah picked it up slowly, pretending to examine his meal. The tip was dull, the wood splintered, but as he turned it over, he noticed the tiny slit along the side. His pulse quickened. He pried at the opening with his fingernail, just enough to slip out the thin piece of folded paper inside. One word was scrawled in shaky handwriting. Right. Elijah exhaled, carefully slipping the tiny note into his palm before looking up at Peters. I need to get a message out, he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. Peters swallowed hard, shifting his weight from foot to foot. If I help you, I could end up just like, he hesitated. Like Marcus Wright. Elijah finished for him. Peters flinched but didn't deny it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elijah leaned in, gripping the bars. You know what they're doing here is wrong. That's why you're helping me. Peters exhaled sharply, glancing around again before nodding. If you have someone who can pull you out of this, write their name or number. I'll get it to the right place. There was no hesitation. Elijah took the tiny slip of paper, pressed it against the tray, and scribbled a phone number. Malcolm Carter. Peters took it, his fingers tightening around the fragile note like it carried the weight of his own fate. Pray this works, Peters muttered under his breath. If we get caught, we won't. Elijah interrupted. We can't. The young officer nodded once, then turned and walked away. Elijah watched him go, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. For the first time in hours, he felt something other than fear. He felt hope. It didn't last long. Barely 10 minutes later, heavy boots stomped down the hallway. Delaney. He strode toward the cell with slow, deliberate steps, his face unreadable, but his eyes burned with something cold and dangerous. Elijah kept his expression blank, but his muscles tensed. You've been busy, Delaney murmured. Elijah didn't reply. The sheriff tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a half smile. See, that's the problem with smart men. They think they can outplay the system. Delaney took another step forward, lowering his voice. But in this town, Carter, the system swallows men like you whole. He turned and motioned to the two officers flanking him. Move him. Rough hands grabbed Elijah's arms before he could protest, yanking him to his feet. Where are you taking me? He demanded. Delaney didn't answer. They pulled him down the corridor, past rows of empty cells, past the main office where the lights had dimmed for the night, deeper into the station until the air grew stale and suffocating. Finally, they stopped in front of a steel door. One of the officers unlocked it with a heavy key. Inside was a small, windowless room. The concrete walls were bare, the dim light flickering overhead casting eerie shadows. The solitary confinement cell. Elijah's stomach clenched. No one will hear you in here, Delaney murmured as the officers shoved him inside. The door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place. Elijah stood in the suffocating darkness, heart pounding. Peters had the note, but had he made it out in time? Or had Elijah just signed his own death sentence? The grand conference room in the Department of Justice was filled with the murmur of serious voices, the shuffle of papers, and the occasional chime of a phone. The air was thick with discussions of policies and national security concerns. But for Malcolm Carter, none of it mattered when his assistant, James Holloway, leaned in and whispered into his ear. Sir, you have a message, from an unusual source. Malcolm barely spared him a glance, keeping his focus on the senator speaking across the table. Later, he muttered, It's about your brother. The words stopped him cold. His grip on the pen in his hand tightened as he slowly turned to face Holloway. The room around him blurred, the sounds fading into background noise. What about Elijah? James hesitated, eyes darting around as if debating whether to say it out loud. Instead, he discreetly handed Malcolm a phone, one that wasn't his. A cheap burner, the kind people used when they didn't want to be tracked. Malcolm took it, heart pounding, and read the message displayed on the screen. Elijah arrested in Ashford. This isn't a normal arrest. They're going to kill him. Act now. A wave of disbelief surged through him, followed immediately by cold, hard fear. His brother, his brilliant, stubborn brother, was in danger. Not in some legal dispute, not in a courtroom, but in a backwater town that no one was watching. Malcolm's mind raced, searching for possibilities. Elijah was meticulous, always careful. This had to be a mistake. A misunderstanding, but something about the message sent chills down his spine. Who sent this? He asked, his voice lower now, controlled but tense. A source inside the Ashford Police Department. James replied, they used an untraceable number. But whoever it is, they're risking a lot to get this message to you. Malcolm took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He turned to one of his senior aides. "Pull up arrest records in Alabama for the past 24 hours. He ordered. The aide typed furiously, scanning the system, but after a moment, she frowned. "There's no record of Elijah Carter being arrested." Malcolm's chest tightened. "Check again," he said, barely containing his frustration. Another pause. The aide's fingers moved rapidly over the keyboard, searching. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "Sir, if he's in custody, the Ashford Police Department is making sure no one knows." The realization hit like a fist to the gut. They had buried his arrest. They were making him disappear. And if they were doing that, it meant Elijah didn't have much time. Malcolm Carter had faced crises before. He had stood before Congress, taken on corrupt institutions, and battled the most powerful figures in the country. But this was personal. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. "Mitchell," a steady female voice answered. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully," Malcolm said, his tone sharp and urgent. "Elijah's in trouble. He was arrested in Ashford, Alabama. There's no official record of it. Someone inside the department sent me a warning. This is not just a wrongful arrest, they're planning something far worse." A pause. Then, "How long ago?" "Hours. Maybe less. We need to move now." On the other end, Special Agent Sarah Mitchell was already at her desk, pulling up data as they spoke. "Sir, Ashford has one of the highest per capita arrest rates for black men in Alabama. Their conviction rate is suspiciously high, and I'm seeing patterns that suggest a connection to private prison contractors." Malcolm's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what that meant. False charges. People being swallowed into the system for profit. Sarah continued, her voice growing grimmer. "And Marcus Wright? His arrest record has been wiped from all official databases. There's almost no trace of him, except for one flagged report that says he died in custody." A sharp stab of dread shot through Malcolm. If Elijah didn't get out soon, he would be next. "What's the nearest federal task force team we have in the area?" Malcolm asked. "Closest unit is in Montgomery. But if Elijah is still in that police station, we have to move before they transfer him. Once he's out of that building, we might never find him again." Malcolm's grip tightened on the phone. "Send them in. No warning. No red tape. I want federal agents at that station within the hour." "I'll handle it," Sarah assured him. "But sir, if Ashford PD is involved in something this deep, they won't let him go without a fight." "Then let them fight," Malcolm said coldly. "And if anyone gets in your way, you tell them the Attorney General of the United States is coming to Alabama personally." FBI agents moved swiftly. Within minutes of Malcolm's order, a team was assembling. A jet was being prepped. This wasn't just a standard operation anymore, it was a rescue mission. And every second counted. Back in Ashford, Elijah sat in the darkness of his new cell, ears straining for any sound beyond the thick door. Time was slipping away, and he didn't know if his message had gotten out. Then, he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The heavy clank of the lock turning. The door swung open. A man stood in the doorway, face concealed beneath a black ski mask. "Well, Carter," the man said, his voice thick with amusement. "You ready for your final trip?" Elijah's blood ran cold. The silence in the police station had a weight to it, heavy and suffocating. Elijah had lost track of time, but his instincts told him it was deep into the night. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and stale sweat. Every second that passed made it clearer. He wasn't going to make it out of here alive if he didn't act soon. Then, the door to his cell creaked open. Two men stepped inside, both dressed in black, their faces concealed by ski masks. They moved with purpose, with certainty, like they had done this before. "Get up," one of them ordered. Elijah didn't move. He knew better than to make it easy for them. "Where are we going?" His voice was calm, but inside, his pulse hammered. The second man let out a low chuckle. "Just a quick trip, Carter. Shame you don't have a return ticket." Rough hands yanked him to his feet. The cold steel of the handcuffs cut into his wrists as they tightened their grip. A thick cloth was shoved over his head, blinding him. Then, the sound of footsteps, the unmistakable click of a door locking behind them. They were taking him somewhere, and he had a feeling he wouldn't be coming back. The ride was long, or maybe it just felt that way. Elijah sat on the cold metal floor of what he assumed was a van or a truck. The vehicle swaying as it rumbled over uneven terrain. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and something else, dirt. Maybe a construction site? A warehouse? He couldn't tell, but he knew they weren't on a main road anymore. He focused on the sounds instead. The crunch of gravel beneath tires. The occasional distant hoot of an owl. And then, something else. One of the men spoke, his voice cutting through the hum of the engine. Same spot as last time? A pause. Then, the other man replied, his tone casual. Yeah, take him to the usual place. Elijah's stomach turned. The usual place. How many times had they done this before? And how many men like him had never come back? Marcus Wright's name flashed in his mind. If he didn't do something now, he'd be the next one buried in whatever usual place this was. Unbeknownst to his captors, they weren't the only ones on the road that night. A few hundred feet behind them, Daniel Peters followed in a nondescript sedan, keeping his headlights off, his grip tight on the wheel. His gut twisted as he watched the van disappear down a dirt road leading into the woods. This was it. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number he wasn't supposed to have. The line clicked after one ring. Mitchell, a voice answered. They're moving him, Peters said, barely above a whisper. They took him in a black van. No plates. Heading west out of Ashford. Back roads. Mitchell's response was immediate. Keep eyes on them. We're closing in. How fast? Less than 10 minutes. Just don't lose them. Peters swallowed hard, pressing the gas a little harder. He just hoped Elijah had 10 minutes left. The van rolled to a stop. Rough hands grabbed Elijah, dragging him out onto solid ground. His legs nearly gave out beneath him, but they kept him upright, shoving him forward. Then, the cloth over his head was yanked away. The night was dark, the only illumination coming from the van's headlights, casting long shadows over the clearing. Elijah's eyes adjusted quickly, his gaze landing on the ground in front of him. A hole, freshly dug, large enough for a man. His breath came faster now, but he forced himself to stay still, to stay calm. Then, another figure stepped forward, and Elijah felt his stomach drop. Frank Delaney, the police chief of Ashford, stood with an air of certainty, his expression unreadable. In his hand, he held a pistol, the barrel gleaming under the dim light. Elijah lifted his chin, meeting Delaney's gaze. So this is how it ends? Delaney let out a slow, almost amused sigh. You know, Carter, you're a smart guy. Too smart for your own good. Elijah stayed silent, his mind racing. Delaney took another step closer. I warned you. You should have taken the easy way out. Signed a confession. Made it simple. He motioned to the hole behind Elijah. But you had to be difficult. The other men stood in silence, waiting, watching. Elijah's hands curled into fists behind his back. He had spent his life fighting for justice, exposing corruption. But now, in the middle of nowhere, with a gun pointed at his chest, none of that mattered. Delaney exhaled, shaking his head. What a waste. Then, he raised the gun. The click of the safety being disengaged sent a chill through Elijah's spine. The night held its breath. Then, a gunshot, a sharp, deafening crack echoed through the trees. Elijah flinched, expecting pain, but there was none. Instead, Delaney stumbled backward, a burst of red blooming across his shoulder. More gunfire erupted, shouts, chaos, and then, a voice, sharp, commanding, FBI, drop your weapons. The night erupted in gunfire. The instant Delaney pulled the trigger, another shot rang out from the darkness. The bullet struck one of the masked officers, sending him sprawling backward with a grunt of pain. Elijah didn't think, he reacted. He threw himself to the side just as Delaney's shot went wide, missing him by inches. The force of his dive sent him rolling across the dirt, the cold night air biting at his skin as adrenaline surged through his veins. Peters kept firing, forcing Delaney and the remaining officer to scramble for cover behind the van. The wounded man groaned in pain, clutching his shoulder, but Delaney didn't spare him a glance. His focus was entirely on Elijah. His expression caught somewhere between rage and amusement. Elijah took advantage of the chaos. Still handcuffed, He swung his elbows up with as much force as he could, catching the remaining officer under the chin. The man staggered, giving Elijah just enough of an opening to twist, knock him off balance, and grab for the gun at his hip. The officer resisted, but Elijah was desperate. His fingers closed around the grip, and with one final yank, he freed it from the holster. The officer lunged, but Elijah turned the gun upward and fired. The shot went through the man's knee. He collapsed with a howl of agony. Now armed, Elijah turned just in time to see Delaney rising from behind the van. Gun still in hand. You just don't know when to quit, do you? Delaney's voice was almost amused as he straightened his stance. You think one rogue cop and a stolen gun are enough to stop this? Peters was still moving, closing the distance between them. Elijah kept his gun trained on Delaney, his heart hammering against his ribs. You tell me, Elijah said, his voice steady despite the chaos. How many more bodies need to pile up before this is over? Delaney smirked, shaking his head. Bodies pile up all the time, Carter. That's the way the world works. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. But you're an exception. You actually thought the law would protect you. Elijah's grip on the gun tightened. You're done, Delaney. Give up. Delaney took a slow step forward. Am I? A sudden movement, his fingers twitching toward something at his waist. Elijah saw it a split second too late. Delaney wasn't unarmed. A knife, small, but deadly, his fingers wrapped around the handle. Elijah's muscles tensed. He could fire. He should fire. But before he could make the decision, a sudden explosion of headlights cut through the night. Engines roared. Tires screeched. Then, a voice boomed through a loudspeaker. FBI, drop your weapons. Hands in the air. Delaney froze, his expression shifting from amusement to fury. The forest around them erupted into movement as a dozen federal agents swarmed the clearing, their guns trained on Delaney and his remaining men. Peters took a quick step back, raising his hands in a show of compliance, while Elijah exhaled sharply, lowering his stolen gun. Delaney's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching at his side. Don't do it, Elijah warned. For a moment, it looked like Delaney would listen. Then, with one last glance at the surrounding agents, he turned on his heel and ran. Suspect fleeing. Agent Mitchell shouted, "Move in." FBI agents surged forward, but Delaney was already disappearing into the trees. One of his men tried to follow, but a well-placed shot from an agent took him down before he got far. The others surrendered, dropping their weapons as agents restrained them. Elijah, still handcuffed, slumped slightly against the van, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The gunfire had stopped. The immediate threat was over. But as he looked toward the darkened tree line where Delaney had vanished, he knew it wasn't over. Not really. Mitchell approached, giving him a quick once-over. You okay? Elijah let out a dry chuckle. Define, okay. She smirked slightly before nodding to one of her agents. Get those cuffs off him. As the cold steel was finally removed from his wrists, Elijah rolled his shoulders, trying to shake off the ache. He should have felt relief. He should have felt safe. But all he felt was an uneasy knot forming in his gut. Delaney was still out there, and if tonight had proven anything, it was that this wasn't just about one corrupt cop. This was about something bigger, something deeper. Elijah had survived, but the war had only just begun. The forest swallowed Delaney whole. Thick branches clawed at his clothes as he sprinted through the underbrush, his breath ragged, his heart hammering. The shouts of the FBI agents faded behind him, replaced by the steady rhythm of his own footsteps and the rustling of leaves underfoot. He had the advantage. This land was familiar, a place he had hunted in, hidden in, long before this night. They'd have to be faster than him to catch him. Sarah Mitchell was no fool. She led the search with sharp precision, her voice cutting through the static of the FBI radios. Fan out. He's heading west. Don't let him reach the main road. Agents moved in formation, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. But the trees were thick, the terrain uneven. Delaney knew exactly where to step, how to disappear into the shadows. Within minutes, the agents lost sight of him. Near the edge of the clearing, Elijah stood next to an idling FBI vehicle, his muscles taut with frustration. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to act. He had come too far. Endured too much. To let Delaney slip through his fingers now. Mitchell placed a firm hand on his chest, stopping him before he could take off after the fleeing man. "You're exhausted," she said, "and unarmed. I'm not waiting here." Elijah snapped. "If he escapes, this whole thing was for nothing. Then let the FBI handle it." Elijah held her gaze. He could see the calculation in her eyes. The way she was weighing protocol against instinct. But this wasn't just another fugitive to be arrested. This was personal. Mitchell hesitated a second too long. Elijah moved. Before she could stop him, he ducked behind the vehicle and grabbed a sidearm from the emergency supply kit. By the time Mitchell registered what he was doing, he had already melted into the darkness. "Damn it," she cursed, grabbing her radio. "Carter's gone rogue. Track him down before he does something reckless." But Elijah had no intention of being stopped. He plunged into the woods, moving fast despite the exhaustion weighing him down. His mind filtered through every piece of information he had on Delaney, his habits, his tactics, the way he always seemed to be one step ahead. Then, just ahead, something caught his eye. A footprint, faint, but clear, pressed deep into the damp earth. Fresh. Elijah slowed his breathing, following the barely perceptible trail. A snapped branch, a scuff in the dirt, and then, a flicker of movement. Elijah raised his stolen gun, steadying his grip. "I see you," he murmured. Delaney was just up ahead, standing near a break in the trees where the moonlight cut through the canopy. His back was to Elijah, but his body was tense. He knew he was being followed. Slowly, deliberately, Elijah stepped forward, leveling the gun at Delaney's back. "Don't move." Delaney turned his head slightly, the faintest smirk playing on his lips. "You sure about that, Carter?" he drawled. Elijah didn't lower the weapon. "Hands where I can see them." Delaney exhaled, his shoulders rising and falling. "You know," he said, almost conversationally, "you don't have to do this. You got out alive. Most people don't." Elijah's jaw clenched. "Turn around, now." Delaney did. His hands were still at his sides, deceptively relaxed. His gaze flicked down to the gun in Elijah's hands. "Then back up." "You gonna shoot me?" he taunted. "Or are you waiting for the FBI to clean up your mess?" Elijah's grip tightened. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to pull the trigger. To put an end to this nightmare once and for all. Then he saw it. Delaney's fingers, barely moving, inching toward his belt. Elijah had a second to react. But Delaney was fast. With a sudden flick of his wrist, he tossed something into the air. Elijah's instincts screamed at him to duck just as a plume of thick gray smoke exploded between them. A flashbang. Elijah staggered back, vision blurred, ears ringing. The trees around him spun, the world tipping sideways. By the time he fought through the haze and lifted his gun again, Delaney was gone. Elijah cursed under his breath, blinking away the residual white spots in his vision. The sound of distant engines roared to life. Then he heard it, Mitchell's voice crackling over the radio, still clipped to his jacket. Possible vehicle on the move. Suspect may be in transit, southbound highway. Elijah stumbled forward, pushing through the trees until he reached a break in the foliage. Below, a road stretched out into the night. And just in time, he saw it, a set of taillights disappearing into the distance. Delaney was escaping. Mitchell's voice came through again, sharp and urgent. "We can't lose him. Set up roadblocks, now." Elijah's fists clenched at his sides as he watched the car speed away. They were running out of time. The walls of the FBI's temporary command center hummed with quiet urgency. Digital screens glowed with satellite images, financial records, and live feeds from agents still scouring the Alabama highways. But Elijah barely registered any of it. His mind was caught in a loop, replaying the moment Delaney slipped through their fingers. The man wasn't just a corrupt cop, he was a ghost, disappearing into the cracks of a system designed to protect people like him. Sarah Mitchell dropped a thick file onto the table in front of him, jolting him from his thoughts. "You should see this," she said. Elijah opened the folder. What he found inside sent a chill through his bones. Dozens of arrest records from Ashford, stretching back nearly 2 decades. Men like Marcus Wright, business owners, Community leaders, activists, systematically targeted, arrested on fabricated charges, and funneled into a prison pipeline that led straight to for-profit correctional facilities. Their assets seized, their reputations destroyed, and in many cases, their lives ended under mysterious circumstances. It wasn't random. It wasn't just Ashford. This is a machine, Elijah muttered. Sarah nodded. And Delaney is just one cog in it. She reached over, flipped a few pages, and pointed at a name highlighted in red. The real power behind this, she said, isn't local law enforcement. It's something much bigger. Elijah scanned the name. The committee. The words sat on the page like a loaded gun. The hell is the committee? He asked. Sarah exhaled sharply. That's the problem. We don't know exactly, but they're pulling the strings. We traced payments from Delaney's offshore accounts, millions in laundered money, all leading back to a network of shadow organizations that funnel cash into lobbying efforts, judicial campaigns, and even private prisons. Elijah clenched his jaw. This isn't just about racism, he said. It's about power, control, keeping certain people in place while others profit off their downfall. Sarah's phone buzzed. She answered, listening intently before her face hardened. We have a new problem, she said, hanging up. Delaney isn't running. He just made a call. And whoever picked up, they have enough pull to make a counterattack. Elijah felt the weight of the words settle in his chest. They're not just going to let this slide, he said. Sarah shook her head. No, they're going to fight back. Elijah looked down at the folder again. The names of the ruined lives printed in black ink staring back at him. He had thought escaping Ashford was the end of the battle. He was wrong. The tension in the FBI's command center was thick enough to cut with a knife. Screens flickered with live surveillance feeds, reports from agents stationed across Alabama, and a flashing red alert signaling the manhunt for Frank Delaney. But Elijah wasn't looking at any of it. His eyes were locked on the folder in front of him, the one that held the names of men who had disappeared before him. Sarah Mitchell stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. You don't have to do this, she said. Elijah exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. If we stop now, nothing changes. The committee keeps running their operation. Another Marcus Wright, another Elijah Carter will be next. And Delaney? He'll get away with all of it. Sarah studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then we need to move fast, she said. Before she could say anything else, an agent burst into the room, panting. We've got a problem, he said. Two, actually. Elijah straightened. What happened? First, Harold Banks, the informant we pulled from Ashford, was just found dead in his motel room. Execution style. Sarah cursed under her breath. And the second? The agent hesitated before answering. Daniel Peters is missing. Last communication was 2 hours ago. His car was found abandoned outside Montgomery. The words hit Elijah like a fist to the gut. He slammed his hand against the table. Delaney isn't running, he growled. He's fighting back. Sarah grabbed her phone, barking orders to mobilize teams to locate Peters. But before she could finish, her screen lit up with an incoming message. An anonymous sender. A video file attached. She exchanged a wary glance with Elijah before pressing play. The screen showed a dimly lit room. Peters was tied to a chair, his face bruised. A figure stepped into the frame. Delaney. He crouched beside Peters, flashing a cold, amused smile. Carter, he drawled. You want me? You want to stop all this? Fine. Come find me. He leaned in closer to the camera. But if you do, you'd better be ready to lose. The screen went black. Elijah's jaw tightened. He'd spent his life fighting battles in courtrooms, believing in justice, believing in the system. But now, justice wouldn't come from a verdict or a judge's gavel. Delaney had just changed the rules, and Elijah was going to play by them. The air inside the command van was thick with tension. Maps of Birmingham flickered on screens, each marked with red dots pinpointing known associates of Delaney. The FBI had locked onto an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Peters was in there. Time was running out. Elijah sat in the corner, listening as Sarah Mitchell went over the tactical approach. But he already knew what she was going to say. We go in fast and controlled. No warning, no negotiations. We neutralize Delaney and secure Peters before they move him again. She turned, locking eyes with Elijah. And you are not coming. Elijah leaned forward, his voice low but steady. That's not your call to make. Sarah sighed. Elijah, you're a civilian. You have no training for this. He shook his head. This isn't just about training. This is about Peters. He risked everything to save me. I won't sit back while you decide if he's worth saving or not. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. Stay close to me. No heroics. The convoy moved out. The FBI vehicles sped through the dark streets, closing in on their target. The warehouse loomed ahead, silent, but carrying an air of imminent danger. When they arrived, agents fanned out, surrounding the perimeter. The plan was simple. Breach, clear, extract. But as the first team moved in, the night erupted with gunfire. It was a trap. Sarah yanked Elijah down behind a stack of crates as bullets whizzed past. Damn it, Delaney knew we were coming. Inside the warehouse, the situation was even worse. Peters was tied to a chair in the center of the room, his face swollen from repeated blows. Delaney paced in front of him, checking his watch. He should be here by now, he muttered. One of his men smirked. Maybe he's smarter than you thought. Delaney scowled. No, Carter's an idiot. He's coming. And he was right. Elijah slipped into the warehouse from a side entrance. He moved carefully, sticking to the shadows, until he saw Peters. His stomach clenched at the sight of him. But he had no time to process it. Delaney's voice rang out. Well, right on time. Elijah turned, finding himself staring down the barrel of Delaney's gun. Hands where I can see them. Carter. Elijah complied, stepping forward slowly. Let him go. Delaney chuckled, shaking his head, still playing the hero. Huh? I'll give you a choice then. He reached behind him and tossed a pistol at Elijah's feet. Pick it up. Elijah didn't move. Delaney took a step closer. I said, pick it up. What do you want? Elijah asked, his voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. Delaney's smile widened. It's simple. Kill Peters. And I let you walk out of here. Elijah stared at him, unblinking. That's not happening. Delaney sighed. Shame. I thought you were smarter than that. He cocked his gun, aiming straight at Elijah's head. Guess I was wrong. Before he could pull the trigger, a gunshot rang out. Delaney jerked forward, eyes wide, then staggered. Blood bloomed across his chest. Elijah turned. Peters was slumped in his chair, but his hands were free now. Gripping a pistol, he had done it. He had shot Delaney. The corrupt sheriff collapsed to the ground. Gasping for breath, Elijah rushed to Peters, untying his restraints as the FBI stormed in. Delaney lay there, choking on his own blood, but he still managed to force out a final, rasping laugh. You think this is over? He whispered. The committee, they'll come for you. Then he went still. Elijah straightened, breathing heavily. Around him, agents secured the remaining men, shouting into their radios, but he barely heard any of it. Because Delaney was right. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The weight of Delaney's final words clung to Elijah like a ghost. Even in death, the man had left a parting gift, one that Elijah could not afford to ignore. The committee was more than just a corrupt network. It was a fully functional machine, one that had been operating in the shadows for years. Sarah Mitchell's office at FBI headquarters was a flurry of activity. Agents moved between desks, shuffling through classified documents and connecting dots that had remained hidden for too long. On the central screen, a financial web stretched across the United States, linking private prison executives, judges, and state officials. Sarah stood next to Elijah, arms crossed, her face grim. We found something. She tapped the screen, zooming in on a series of wire transfers. Delaney was just a foot soldier. The real players are here, judges, state representatives, even people in federal agencies. And they're expanding. Elijah's stomach twisted. How bad is it? Sarah exhaled sharply. They've already laid the groundwork to push their operations into 20 states. If we don't act fast, thousands more people will be caught in their pipeline, arrested, sentenced, and funneled into prisons for profit. The enormity of it all pressed down on him. He had started this journey thinking it was about one corrupt sheriff. Now, it had turned into something far bigger, a battle against an institution designed to keep people like him powerless. Malcolm Carter entered the room, his usual air of composure slightly frayed. As the U.S. Attorney General, he had seen his fair share of corruption. But this was something else entirely. "We're launching a full-scale operation," Malcolm announced. "Federal indictments, asset freezes, and coordinated raids on every known facility linked to the committee." He locked eyes with his brother. This ends now. But just as quickly as hope had flickered to life, it was extinguished. Elijah left the FBI field office that evening, heading back to his apartment in New Orleans. He barely made it 3 blocks before he knew something was wrong. The streets were too quiet. The normal hum of city life had faded, leaving only the low growl of an engine behind him. Then came the first shot. The bullet shattered the back windshield, sending glass raining down inside the car. Elijah swerved, heart pounding, as more shots rang out. A black SUV closed in behind him, its headlights blinding in his rearview mirror. They weren't trying to scare him. They were trying to kill him. He yanked the wheel hard to the right, taking a sharp turn down an alley. But the SUV followed. The moment he hit open road again, a second vehicle blocked his path. Trapped, adrenaline surged through his veins. He yanked the gear shift, throwing the car into reverse. But before he could move, a figure stepped out of the SUV. Black tactical gear, mask, silencer attached to the barrel of his gun. Elijah's mind raced. No badge, no orders to surrender. This wasn't an arrest. This was an execution. The assassin raised his gun. Then the sound of screeching tires filled the air. Another vehicle came barreling toward them, an unmarked sedan. A gunshot cracked the silence as the masked man staggered back, his shoulder erupting in red. The shooter inside the sedan leaned out just enough for Elijah to recognize the face. Sarah Mitchell. She threw open the passenger door. "Get in." Elijah didn't hesitate. He dove inside just as Sarah floored it, sending them speeding through the streets. More bullets followed, but they didn't slow. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. "They're trying to kill me." Sarah kept her eyes on the road. That was never a question. By the time they reached the safe house, Elijah knew one thing for certain: he wasn't just a problem for the committee. He was now their number one target. Malcolm's phone rang that night. An unknown number. He considered ignoring it, but something told him to answer. The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm. "If you proceed with your little operation, your brother won't see the sunrise." Malcolm gripped the phone tighter, his pulse hammering in his ears. Who the hell is this? A chuckle. Just someone who understands leverage. The line went dead. At that moment, Malcolm Carter realized he was no longer just fighting corruption. He was fighting to keep his brother alive. The cold air inside the unmarked FBI van was thick with tension. Elijah sat in the back, across from Sarah Mitchell, who was checking her sidearm with a focused expression. The plan was clear: infiltrate, secure evidence, and extract. But deep down, Elijah knew nothing ever went according to plan. Their target was an unassuming office building in Washington, D.C., registered under a shell company. According to intercepted communications, it was the operational hub of the committee, a place where the real decisions were made. If they could seize the right documents, they could bring the whole network crashing down. The van pulled up a block away. Elijah adjusted his bulletproof vest, feeling the weight of the moment. He had faced corrupt cops, violent hitmen, and near-death experiences. But this was different. This was stepping into the lion's den. Sarah's voice snapped him back. "We go in quiet. Get the files. Get out." Elijah nodded, but a part of him knew there would be nothing quiet about this. They entered the building through a service entrance, following a corridor lined with security cameras. Sarah's team worked fast, disabling alarms and accessing restricted floors. Once inside the main office, they spread out, sifting through cabinets and hard drives. Elijah rifled through a drawer, heart pounding as he pulled out a stack of classified documents. The content made his stomach turn: arrest quotas, payments to judges, political donations. The scope of the operation was even bigger than he had imagined. Then he found the file that made his blood run cold. A list of high-value targets. At the top of the page, in bold letters, was his own name. Before he could process it, the building's security system let out a shrill alarm. The lights flickered, and metal shutters slammed down over the exits. They had been found out. Sarah's radio crackled. Multiple hostiles inbound. Get out now. But it was too late. The first shots rang out from the hallway, shattering the office glass. Armed operatives stormed in, moving with trained precision. Elijah and Sarah dove for cover behind a desk as bullets tore through the walls. Sarah returned fire, wincing as a bullet grazed her arm. Elijah grabbed a fallen weapon, forcing himself to stay calm. He had never been in a firefight before, but survival was the only option. We need an exit, Sarah shouted. Elijah scanned the room, spotting an emergency staircase leading to the rooftop. This way. They fought their way through the chaos, dodging bullets and taking down attackers. By the time they reached the rooftop, Sarah was bleeding heavily, and Elijah's hands were shaking. A black helicopter hovered overhead, FBI reinforcements. But even as the rope ladder dropped, more gunmen appeared below, unloading rounds into the night sky. Elijah helped Sarah onto the ladder as bullets zipped past. He climbed after her, gripping the rungs tightly as the helicopter pulled away. Below them, the building erupted in flames. The committee had activated a failsafe, destroying every piece of evidence inside. But they had made one miscalculation. As Elijah collapsed onto the helicopter floor, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a hard drive. It was the only piece of evidence left. Sarah looked at him, breathing heavily. Tell me that has what we need. Elijah exhaled, staring at the device in his hand. It has everything. But even as the city lights stretched beneath them, he knew the war was far from over. The committee would not go down without a fight. And neither would he. Elijah sat in the FBI conference room, his fingers drumming against the cold steel of the table. Across from him, Sarah Mitchell winced as a medic wrapped her wounded shoulder. Around them, agents moved quickly, voices overlapping as they scrambled to process the evidence they had recovered. The air was electric with urgency. But underneath it was something else, an unspoken fear that this wasn't over. At the head of the table, Malcolm Carter stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. His gaze was locked on the large screen displaying the decrypted files from the hard drive. Every document, every transaction, every secret had unraveled like a thread in an elaborate web, revealing the true scope of the committee's operations. This isn't just a corruption ring. Malcolm finally spoke, his voice low and steady. This is systemic control. They've infiltrated law enforcement, the judiciary, private prisons, hell, even certain congressional offices. Elijah exhaled sharply. He had known the system was broken, but he had never imagined the rot ran this deep. The names on the list were staggering: state officials, federal judges, police commissioners. Some were household names, figures who had built careers on the promise of law and order. Now, they were exposed as architects of injustice, profiting from the suffering of those they swore to protect. Sarah cleared her throat, wincing slightly as she shifted in her seat. If we don't act fast, they'll start covering their tracks. We need immediate arrests before anyone disappears. Malcolm nodded. I'm already coordinating with the Attorney General. Indictments are being drafted as we speak. We're going public with this. He turned to Elijah. You should be the one to deliver the statement. Elijah hesitated. He had spent his career fighting legal battles from inside a courtroom, not from behind a podium. But this wasn't just another case. This was about dismantling a machine that had destroyed countless lives, including his own. Later that evening, standing before a sea of reporters, Elijah faced the cameras. The world needed to hear the truth. For years, a shadow organization known as the Committee has manipulated our justice system for personal and political gain. He began. They have orchestrated false arrests, exploited private prisons, and silenced those who dared to expose them. But today, that ends. Flashes went off as journalists scrambled to capture his words. He met their gazes, making sure they understood the gravity of what he was saying. This is not just about corruption. This is about power. Who has it? And who has been denied it? We will not stop until every individual responsible is brought to justice. The room erupted in questions. But Elijah stepped back, letting Malcolm take over. His job wasn't to navigate the political aftermath. His job was to make sure the truth was no longer buried. But even as the headlines spread, as FBI raids swept across the country, one question lingered in his mind. Not everyone had been caught. Late that night, as he sat in his apartment reviewing the files again, his phone buzzed. A single text appeared on the screen. From an unknown number. "You may have cracked the surface, but you'll never destroy us." Elijah stared at the message, his jaw tightening. He had won a battle. But the war? The war had just begun. Months had passed since the night the committee was exposed. The courtroom battles had been relentless. The media coverage relentless. And yet, Elijah Carter knew that justice, true justice, was still a long way off. Dozens of high-ranking officials had been indicted, but some had slipped away, vanishing like shadows before the dawn. There was a bitter truth to accept: powerful people rarely fell without a fight. He watched from the gallery as the first wave of convictions was announced. Judges, politicians, police chiefs, men and women who had built their careers on the suffering of others were now facing the very system they had corrupted. Some pled guilty, hoping for leniency. Others fought tooth and nail, hiring the best defense teams money could buy. But the evidence was undeniable. Sarah Mitchell stood beside him, her arm still in a sling from the gunfight weeks before. She had been promoted to senior special agent, now leading a task force to dismantle what remained of the committee's influence. She glanced at Elijah as the gavel struck, sentencing another corrupt official. "This is just the beginning," she murmured. Elijah nodded. He knew she was right. The committee wasn't just a handful of criminals in suits, it was an entire system. A machine that had operated in the shadows for decades. The question was, how many more pieces of it were still out there? Daniel Peters had left Ashford's police department, officially resigning from law enforcement altogether. Instead, he had become the star witness in one of the largest corruption trials in modern history. The man who had once feared for his life was now a symbol of those who had chosen the right side, even when it was dangerous. Elijah had been offered everything in the aftermath: political positions, speaking engagements, even a book deal, but he turned them all down. He didn't want to be a politician. He didn't want fame. "I never wanted power," he told Malcolm over dinner one evening. "I just wanted to make sure no one else went through what I did." His brother had understood. Malcolm had used his position as Attorney General to push for sweeping justice reform, targeting the private prison industry that had profited off the backs of the innocent. Some facilities had already been shut down, their funding revoked. Others were still fighting, lobbying in the background, trying to keep their empire alive. Elijah had seen it before. When you cut off one head, another always grew in its place. One evening, as he sat in his office, a package arrived. No return address, just a plain manila envelope. Inside was a single photograph. A man in a dark suit, shaking hands with a senator. His face was one Elijah recognized: someone high up, someone untouched by the investigation so far. Tucked beneath the photograph was a small, typed note: "We've only scratched the surface." Elijah exhaled slowly, pressing the photo between his fingers. He had thought this fight was coming to an end. Now, he realized, it was only shifting into another battlefield. The war wasn't over. Not yet. Justice isn't just about laws, it's about those willing to stand up when the system is designed to break them. Elijah Carter's fight wasn't just his own. It was a battle for the truth, for the countless voices silenced by corruption. But even as one conspiracy falls, another lurks in the shadows. So we ask you, how much power should one system hold? And what happens when the people meant to protect us become the ones pulling the strings? If you want more gripping stories of truth, betrayal, and the secrets hidden in the dark, make sure to subscribe to Shadow Secrets. Because some stories are too dangerous to stay buried.